Okay, Carrie, go ahead and get started.
All right, thank you, Lily and Mark. I'm excited to be here, and it's nice to hear about your different moths that you like. I think for me, certainly the Luna moth was kind of my gateway moth into really enjoying moths. So, and hopefully you'll get to learn about a few more species tonight. So my name again is Carrie Wickstead, and I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources within our Wildlife and Heritage Service. So we manage the state's wildlife resources, the ducks and the bucks, and everything else in between, including our moths. And we're primarily funded by hunting license fees and excise taxes on firearms, even though we do so much more than just focus on hunting. So tonight, I'm going to take you into a journey of learning about moths and some of their biology, ecology, a few rare species, and ways to help them. We have a small group, so feel free to ask questions along the way because I'm here to teach you about moths. I will qualify that I am not an entomologist. I'm a biologist and I just love nature. So I might not be able to answer all your questions, but I'll try my best. And then I'll also send some follow-up information afterwards. So just to get started, a lot of folks focus on butterflies, and I know that certainly was me in the beginning, but it was really mind-blowing just to know the sheer number of moths that are found around the world, here in Maryland and in other areas. So it's estimated for every species of butterfly on the planet, there are at least 9 species of moths. And we're constantly finding new species of moths. Here in North America, there are about 12,000 species of moths and around 900 species of butterflies. So we have significant numbers of moths and ones that we still need more information about. So let's test your knowledge really quick. What are some of the differences between moths and butterflies? So anybody knows some of the differences between a moth and a butterfly? You can type them in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
Their antennae.
Antennae, yeah. What's significant about their antennae?
Well, the moth has the fringy and the butterfly has the knobs on the end.
Yep. That's definitely one thing. So looking for those feathered antennae, which are going to help them navigate at night versus the clubbed antennae on the butterflies.
But what are the knobs for? Is that for smelling things?
Yeah. So
I got it.
Yeah, it's being able to make those senses in the middle of the night. So especially some of the larger nocturnal moths, because we do have some day flying moths, they have really large feathering antennae. And certainly you can look at the differences of the antennae for males and females for some species as well. Any other thoughts on besides the antennae of things to look for?
Isn't it a powder? What is on the moth that,
Yeah.
if you touch it, it powders things, or?
Yeah, both butterflies and moths have it. And so they're called like the lepidote scales. So they're special, coatings on the wings. And it could be, that the moths have more of it just to stay a little warmer, but I'm not 100% sure.
I'm curious about the distinction between moths and butterflies in terms of nocturnal versus daytime. I used to think that was definite, but I've seen moths out during the day, so I'm curious what that's actually like.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and also in the world of nature, there usually isn't always all the time. I find there are a lot of gray areas. So here are some of the typical characters to look for as differences between moths and butterflies. As it was mentioned earlier by Linda, moths typically have this feathered antennae. So look at those. So some of them can be really, really large, and that's for that chemical sensory movement at night. And typically butterflies have those clubbed antennae. Moths, when they go through the pupal stage, they're in a cocoon, whereas butterflies are in the chrysalis. And think of this as that teenage stage where they're in those capsules there. So the cocoons are covered by, it's a hard case covered by silk on the outside, whereas the chrysalis for the butterflies is just that hard exoskeleton that doesn't have that silk on the outside. Moths often rest with their wings open, and butterflies often keep their wings closed, but that's not all the time. And also moths are typically active at night. The majority of our moth species are active at night, where most butterflies are active during the day. But of course, we have some that don't read the book and they're active whenever they feel like being active. So just to go through the life cycle of the moths, so they have what's known as complete metamorphosis, just like our butterflies. So they start off in that egg stage, and as Mark talked about earlier, moths often lay their eggs on specific plants called host plants. And so they lay their eggs on the host plants, and then the life cycle of the Luna moth, it's about a week until they hatch. And then they have these little caterpillars that feed off of those host plants. And throughout the caterpillar stage, they can have different stages of caterpillars where they molt and get larger. For the Luna moth, they have 5 instars or 5 different stages. And it typically takes them about 3 weeks to feed and all of that and get through those 5 instars until they create that cocoon. And that cocoon for the Luna moths is actually going to be created on the ground, usually in a rolled up leaf under leaf litter. So for this species, leaf litter is extremely important for that stage of its life cycle. Inside that silken cocoon, you'll have that hard pupal case, and then the adult will emerge. And some of these have overwintered as pupae, and they're emerging right now. So if you're lucky, you might see some Luna moths this time of year. So there are over 2,500 species of moths that have been found in Maryland, everything from large, beautiful species like some of our silk moths, including Io moths and things like that, to smaller, lesser known species like these leaf blotch minor moths that, for those of you who are backyard gardeners, might notice little tunnels and tubes in some of your leaves of your backyard plants, and those may have been created by some of these miners. We have brilliantly colored moths like the scarlet-winged lichen moth, which actually blends itself into different types of lichen. And we even have some that camouflage themselves as bird poop, like the beautiful wood nymph, which you can find throughout forests in Maryland. Moths serve many roles in our ecosystems, and primarily they are an important prey species for a number of different animals, from frogs and toads to our larger mammals and birds and things of that nature, and even to other insects. Certainly some moths are pests. So think about clothes moths and invasive species like the gypsy moths, and a lot of moths can be agricultural pests as well. Moths serve roles in pollination. Not all moths are pollinators. So some, like our giant silk moths, like the Luna moth, actually don't feed as adults. So they're not out there pollinating at all. They're just looking pretty. And their sole job as an adult is just to mate and reproduce, essentially. But this picture right here is depicting a yucca moth, which has a very special relationship with yucca. So this adult moth actually does not feed. It doesn't have a mouth part where it can feed. It actually has the tentacle-like appendages, which when the females hatch after they mate, she uses those tentacles to pick up pollen from yucca. She'll go find another plant and she'll pollinate the yucca plant and then lay her eggs inside that yucca for her caterpillars to eventually feed off of the yucca fruit that are formed from that pollination process. Now, certainly they don't eat all the yucca fruit, so there's enough for that yucca to be able to reproduce and enough for that moth to also be able to reproduce. So they have an extremely special relationship, and the loss of one or the other could really affect this relationship. In the world of moths too, there are a lot of cool adaptations that they have. And for those of you who stare at a lot of screens, if you appreciate anti-glare technologies, well, you can thank a moth because it was actually modeled after the anti-glare on many moth eyes. So that's how we have that technology for our screens. So in the world of moths, there are also moths that mimic, and these are just a few of the species. So only one of these 3 you can find here in Maryland. You might, if you're a Silence of the Lambs fan, you might be familiar with the death's head moth. So there are actually 3 different species of this kind of moth. And they make a scream type noise, and they have this coloration because they get into honeybee hives and they mimic the queen by making noises that the queen honeybee would make. And then they go in and eat all the honey, essentially. So that's their reason for the mimicry. One of my favorite moths, and Keith, this is for your wife, she likes spiders. The meadowlark moth actually mimics its predator, which is a jumping spider. So it folds its wings up and bounces around to look like a jumping spider just to prevent from being eaten. So
That's pretty cool.
yeah, cool strategy, right? So it's an
Yeah.
interesting strategy you don't see in a lot of insects mimicking their predators. You can find them down in Ecuador. In our neck of the woods, we have quite a few moths that actually mimic things like wasp. So we have the Riley's clearwing moth, which as an adult is mimicking that yellow jacket. And as you might know, yellow jackets are nothing to mess with. So this moth knows what it's doing by doing that mimicry there. This one feeds on plants in the Solanaceae family, which is the family that contains tomatoes and things like that, but it primarily hosts on Carolina horse nettle here in Maryland. There are also moths that jam, and it's really interesting looking at how moths evolved their hearing. And for a long time, it was thought that moths evolved their ability to hear due to predation by bats, but it actually came much later. So there's a type of tiger moth, the Batholia, that actually can sense the frequency of bat sonar. And essentially, when it detects that bat sonar, it sends clicking noises back to the bat and tells the bat, don't eat me, I don't taste good. For many other moths that get eaten by bats, they actually, when they feel those vibrations from the sonar, some of them will actually drop to the ground and play dead as a way to get away from the bats and being eaten that night. So in your gardens, you might see a lot of this on certain plants. You'll see little tunnels or skeletonized leaves. So there are quite a few of our smaller moths, we call them micro moths, that actually feed on these leaves. And so their larvae, their caterpillars are so tiny that a lot of times we can't see them, but we'll see the evidence that's left behind. So here's some examples of a mined aspen leaf up here at the top. So you'll see those little squiggles in the leaves. If you have a plant called columbine, this time of year, you'll also see a lot of those columbine leaf miners that do those types of squiggles as they feed on parts of the plant. And then later in the season, I tend to see these skeletonized leaves, and those have been fed on by different types of skeletonizers. So another type of moth. Now,
I'd like to share with my volunteers, I show them a leaf with the line through it. I say, there's a bug in there that gets its lunch by mining a tunnel through the leaf. They're called leaf miners. But now, are they all moths? Some leaf miners are other bugs, right?
Yes, some of them are other bugs. So some of them are flies and some of them are actually wasps that do the mining. So there's a variety of insects that do the mining, and they're important food for a lot of our birds. So I've seen this past winter, I got to actually experience a ruby-crowned kinglet that was feeding off of holly leaf miners. So it was going through the holly leaves that had all those little tunnels and picking out those leaf miners as an insect protein in the winter. So as gardeners, sometimes we don't like these types of leaves, but they're important food, and it's usually just an aesthetic issue for a lot of these plants. Many of these moths are not harming the plants in the long term. So we've got some really weird moths here in Maryland, and here's just a selection of a few. And I've selected some of the weird looking caterpillars just so you can get an idea of some of the diversity that we have. This spun glass slug moth is just wild looking, and it's one that I haven't seen on my own, but it has crystal-like barbs. It's found in central and southern Maryland, and it loses its barbs with age, and certainly if you try to handle it, so don't pick it up. And their moths are actually surprisingly plain for having such fantastic looking caterpillars there. For those of you who have evergreens, you might be familiar with these evergreen bagworms. They're actually native, but they can be extremely problematic to cypress and spruce and cedars and things like that. Sometimes they even go after deciduous trees like sycamores. They typically thrive in urban habitats, and the females actually never leave these cocoons. The males mate with her through the open end, back end of the case. And she has no eyes, no wings, no antenna, no mouth, just a really, really strong smell that attracts the males to come and mate with her. So these are also a very important food source for a number of our bird species. Then we have some other crazy looking caterpillars. This is a black-waved flannel moth that kind of looks like a hairpiece there that walks along. So it actually has irritating hairs or urticating hairs that you don't really want to touch. And it hosts on a number of different plant species, a lot of different tree species and things like that. And you'll often see it a little later in the summer and early fall as a caterpillar. Moving on to a few more species. My favorite that I've never actually seen as a caterpillar is this hickory horndevil / royal walnut moth. So this is our largest caterpillar that we have in the state. And it's some of them can get almost the size of a hot dog. So I would just love to see one. They remind me of a dragon, especially with these hair pieces that it has there. And it takes over a month for it to go from the caterpillar to the pupal form. It actually will throw up its guts and turn turquoise right before it pupates. And then it burrows down into the dirt. So this is another species that really needs that leaf litter and nice dirt and things like that to get down in. So it feeds off of a lot of hardwood species, walnuts in particular, as its adult name suggests, the royal walnut. So that's usually a good plant to look for this giant caterpillar. The Pandora's Sphinx moth is another large moth that also pupates under the soil over the winter. And it actually, if it's the caterpillars are poked or prodded or whatnot, if they feel threatened, they'll actually rear up and vomit like a vulture just to get the offending predator to leave them alone. So the adults actually, even though they're native to Maryland and the eastern United States, they'll feed on some non-native plants like petunias. So they'll go to them, and they host on different types of vines. So grape and porcelain berry and Virginia creeper are some of the favored plants for this species. And speaking of Sphinx, for those of you who have vegetable gardens, you're probably really familiar with the tobacco and tomato hornworms, which are actually a type of Sphinx moth, so related to that Pandora's Sphinx. These are important pollinators. They're active at dawn, from dawn until dusk. And so they can go around and pollinate. And the way that they vibrate their wings, it's not just, they're also pushing the pollen around. So that's one of the ways that they help to pollinate and everything. But they have these really large caterpillars, which if you have tomato plants, you might have seen these big old chunky caterpillars. And this is actually one from my gardens from several years ago. And I didn't notice it until I saw all of these white grains that look like rice all over it. So those are actually braconid wasp larvae, or sorry, braconid wasp pupae. So these are the pupal cases of a braconid wasp. The female lays the eggs inside of the caterpillar. They develop inside the caterpillar, and right as they pupate, they come out as these cases on the outside of the caterpillar. So this one is already doomed. And the first time I saw this, I felt really bad for this caterpillar, because even though it was eating my tomatoes, I was like, oh, I feel so bad. And I knocked off a couple of the cocoons, but it still withered up and died because it's already been damaged by those wasps. So these cocoons, again, are essentially the size of a grain of rice, and an adult wasp is going to emerge from there. So this is just a natural process that happens that helps keep the Sphinx moths in control and in check in different areas. So moving on to some other wonderful moth species, another one of my favorite moths is the rosy maple moth. And this is a species that when I first saw it, when I was out in West Virginia doing my graduate research, I didn't believe that it could be native or real. I was researching invasive plants and impacts on ginseng, and one fell out of a tree right next to me. And this was before we had smartphones and I could take a picture of it and identify it. And I was like, this beautiful yellow and pink moth cannot be from around here. It just can't. It has to be a problematic species. And I wrestled with whether or not I should allow it to stay out there. So since I didn't know, I left it alone, and I went home and identified it. And I was very happy to find out that it is a native moth. So this species is typically active from June until early August, and its caterpillars have these little black horns. They're green with little black horns. And I always thought the coloration was extremely odd until I saw a picture of one of them on the seeds or the samaras of red maple trees. And red maples, which have those samaras out right now, have those kind of pinkish yellow samaras. So this is essentially a camouflage technique that this species has. The hummingbird clearwing moth is one of our daytime flying moths. And you can see, since it's out during the day, it doesn't have those really feathered antennae. So it also is a pollinator that uses its rapid wing beats to kind of push the pollen along and help with that pollination. It has a really long tongue, so it feeds off of a different species. Its caterpillars actually host on honeysuckles and viburnums and cherries and plums. So I had a native honeysuckle, the trumpet honeysuckle, up on my deck, and it always got visited by hummingbirds who nectared off of it. And it wasn't until we moved it down to the ground closer to my garden that I got the hummingbird clearwing moth caterpillars on it and started seeing the adults more in my garden. So this is a species, and there's several other clearwing moths, snowberry clearwings and things like that, that are also attracted to the same species, and you could have them around in your gardens. This time of year, phlox and viburnums are favored nectar sources for these different species. Another really cool and common moth is this giant leopard moth. This has a very large black caterpillar with spikes and a red body. So it's really, really distinct. It almost looks like a woolly bear, a giant woolly bear that isn't brown and black striped. And then it turns into this gorgeous adult moth here that you see. So the adults actually release a foul yellow fluid as a defense mechanism, and that's its way to kind of get away from potential predators. This is a species that really doesn't care what it hosts on. It will feed on a ton of different plants. So you'll see a lot of them in a lot of backyards and things like that, because if you have native plants, they will likely be around. So the next group I'm going to talk about are some of the ones that a lot of people will really identify with, and those are the giant silkworm moths. And many of these species do not feed as adults. So the Luna moth falls into this category or this group of moths. So these are our really large, showy species that we have. And so this is the Cecropia moth, and the Cecropia moth, it has a 6-inch wingspan. So it's the largest North American moth, and its first instar is actually very different looking than these later stages of the caterpillars, which are neon colors. So they're like neon green with blues and yellows and reds and oranges and all of that. So this is a species that hosts on over 50 species of deciduous trees. So it's another one that's pretty common in certain areas, as long as you have that habitat for them to pupate in, and certainly native plants for them. Our Polyphemus moth is another one of those large silkworm type moths. And it has a Greek mythology name, and its eyes essentially look like a predator to deter birds and other organisms from trying to eat it. So that's why it has those very large eye spots on the back end. It too has a large and fabulous looking caterpillar. So this one's almost like a neon green in color, and you can find them later in the season because both of these species, the pupae tend to overwinter, so they'll start emerging in the spring, so this time of year, but some of them will also have life stages that breed in the spring and emerge in the summer as well. So I know there was a focus on the rare and uncommon moths that we have here in Maryland. And so with the Department of Natural Resources, we keep a list of rare, threatened, and endangered species, both for animals and plants. And we have those lists up on our website. For our moths, we have just over 30 species that have been declared as either rare or uncommon here in the state. But we don't have a lot of data on these moths. So many of these moth species are ranked as either SU, which is state unknown, so unknown kind of distributions or populations and all of that, or SNR is not ranked. So essentially, we don't have enough data to officially rank them.
And that's American chestnut.
Yes, that's American chestnut.
So we need to bring it back.
Yeah, well, the two
Is
species.
is that action we can do? We can, where they're restoring the American chestnut in several different ways, we could also bring back the moth.
Well, the two
Right.
chestnut species that that were using the chestnut have been declared extinct. But there certainly are other chestnut specialists. Like I think there's a chestnut weevil that I'm not sure is extinct or not. So they might be species that essentially could benefit from the return of the chestnut. And certainly a lot of other wildlife species could really be assisted by the return of some of these uncommon tree species and things like that. So this is something to consider. Is a lot of these species have really special relationships with different types of native plants. So focusing on keeping that native plant biodiversity and all of that, not just in natural areas, but also considering that using our backyards as a way to foster that biodiversity is also really helpful for some of these species.
So when this is over, could you help us have a list of where we want to restore the hosts for these rare species? And that'll be an action item for the Sierra Club?
So I can give you some resources that essentially will help you with trying to figure that out. And we're developing some just for backyard gardeners as
Great.
essentially resources to look at to help support moth diversity in your areas. So two other species that I wanted to talk about. One is the marbled underwing. So this is a species that still exists in North America. So G3 means it's globally rare. So species are ranked on a global scale and also on a state scale. So it is still around globally, but in Maryland, we've considered a historic species because we haven't documented any recent records of this species in a very long time. So we have a whole process that essentially does the.
So where should citizen scientists go look for the marbled underwing in Maryland?
So this is a species that essentially likes kind of wetter areas, and I'm not familiar with all of its host plants, but I'll show you where you can find more information on the next slide about this species and some of our other rare moths. So another species to kind of keep an eye out for is this bald cypress sphinx moth. This is the caterpillar right here. And as its name suggests, it feeds off of bald cypress trees. We don't have a lot of natural stands left. So in places like Battle Creek Cypress Swamp is an important stronghold for the species. And certainly down in the Pocomoke on the lower eastern shore is another stronghold for this species. But some people are starting to plant more bald cypress in areas in their yards and places like that. So this would be a species to kind of keep an eye out for if you do have bald cypress in different locations.
By the way, 20 years ago, I got the Battle Creek Cypress Swamp to start removing invasives, and I check every 5-10 years, and they've kept it up.
Yeah, they do a lot of great work.
Yeah.
So Battle Creek is managed by Calvert County Parks and also the Nature Conservancy. And that's a really important habitat. So this is the list of rare, threatened, and endangered animals in Maryland. Our last update for our animal list was in 2016. We recently updated our plant list in 2021. So you can go onto our website, and I'll share the links with with Lily, and that way she can share them with you if you can't find our pages. But we have information on the 30 different species of moths and other species that are also listed as rare, threatened, and endangered in Maryland, and you can see the ranks, and it talks about the rank system on this. I believe we should have a new animal list coming out sometime this year with updated information. So we have zoologist Jim McCann and Jennifer Selfridge who are primarily working on kind of keeping up to date on these different listings of species. And so, so they'll be using the most current knowledge to create the updated list. And for some of the species, particularly those that are listed as endangered or threatened in Maryland, they actually have to go through legislative review before they can be officially listed as threatened or endangered or in need of conservation. So that's also explained in that rare, threatened, and endangered animals list. So Mark, this is probably, the Nature Serve Explorer is probably one of the things that's the most interesting to you. If you haven't gone to this website, this is put together by Nature Serve, and you can use this for more than just moths and butterflies. You can use this for all different species. And they recently updated the website, and the updates make it look really, really good. But Nature Serve is what all of our natural resource programs, we work with to, essentially identify those different state ranks. So S1 in Maryland is, S1, it means there's a certain number of those populations, and the populations have essentially like they're under threat, or, we have those ranking systems, S1 through 5, with 5 being the most common in the state, S1 being the least common. And so those rankings are actually put together by Nature Serve, and all the different states across the United States use those ranking systems. And so we feed all of this data into Nature Serve so you can look at landscape level impacts to these species and what's going on. So this is the marbled underwing, and you can see it's not even included. Maryland isn't even included on the range anymore, just because it's been so long since it's been seen here. But you can go to the website. It'll tell you that global rank. It shows you the ranks in different states, so you can see how other states are ranking it. And then there's also information on essentially what's happened with this species. So this species is threatened by draining and channelization. The adults are highly mobile, though, so it makes it difficult to define exactly what are populations in these different areas because they move around a lot. The loss of habitat, particularly that channelization and ditching and draining, has really been a huge impact on the marbled underwing. So you can read about the status and see how they're doing in other states, and it actually will have links to different research articles if they're available for some of these states, for some of these species. And if they aren't ranked, it will also tell you, why they don't have different ranks, and a lot of it is due to that lack of data. Another resource that you can use to learn about moths, not just rare moths here in Maryland, but all sorts of different species, is the Maryland Biodiversity Project. And so they are our partners, and they're actually a grassroots nonprofit. And so, so they are collecting data on the biodiversity of all species here in the state. Maryland Biodiversity Project is a really, really strong partner, and this is where you can also help as a community scientist, particularly if you're going out and taking observations via tools like iNaturalist. So Maryland Biodiversity Project is now integrating iNaturalist records into the Biodiversity Project, and they're synthesizing all that data, and then they send some of those updates to the Natural Heritage Program. So they're helping us with that data collection essentially. And through this partnership and all of that, we've had some folks who have found different populations of species that we didn't know existed, or they found some species that weren't documented in the state yet. So it's a really great detection network. And this is really nice as a community science initiative too, because a lot of people have smartphones now. And so you can just take pictures, upload that, and that GPS data and all the data that you put in with those uploads can be really helpful for finding some of these unknown populations, because we have so many more eyes on the ground with all of our phones and things like that.
Carrie, to take a photo with iNaturalist, is there an appropriate way to get the moth to stop moving for a minute?
That's a hard thing to do. I know some hardcore photographers will actually use things like put them in a refrigerator for a little bit to kind of slow them down. I tend to try to just take photos of the critters and try not to disturb them. But if you can get a couple pictures, that's usually helpful. And particularly for these butterfly and moth species, if you can take pictures of the plants that they're using. So either the plants that they're feeding off of as adults or as caterpillars, that can really assist with identification. And just putting down any other information besides just that photo can be really helpful. Like if you see a ton of these caterpillars, write that in the little comment section on iNaturalist, because that might help us find a population that maybe we didn't know about. And Lily, I'll talk to you about ways to view moths at night. So there are some different locations, and I'll mention a couple spots that I like to go to at the end. So I know there's a lot of focus too on helping these different moth species, and really planting native plants and essentially giving them those food sources is the best thing that we can do for a lot of our Lepidoptera, our moths and our butterflies there. And, planting these native plants is important, and it's best to try for straight native species. And when I say that, they're cultivars that are on the market. And so cultivars of some of these native plants have been bred for human traits. So some of them, some of these plants might not get powdery mildew, some of them might bloom longer, things like that. But one of the things is that we don't know when there's that selective breeding going on, what's happening to the nutritional quality of the plants. And there is some research with Dr. Doug Tallamy at a University of Delaware, where he looked at some of the plants, some of the cultivars that had more purpley leaves. Those purple colors in those leaves were actually chemicals that the plants use to protect themselves against herbivores like caterpillars. And so by making those cultivars, they did better in our gardens, but they were less attractive to those butterflies and moths because they couldn't eat them. I'm not saying this is the thing for all cultivars, but it's important to know that simply having those species visit doesn't mean that it's supporting their life cycle. So try your best to go for those straight native species. I know it's difficult to find them in the nursery trade. I certainly have a lot of cultivars in my garden. So just remember, a cultivar of a native plant is always going to be better than a non-native plant or an invasive plant any day. So try your best and do those baby steps and try to help them out like you can. It's important, too, to manage expectations. If you're planting these plants out there for those caterpillars to eat, they're not going to always look good, right? You have to understand that there's going to be holes in your leaves or skeletonized leaves. You might see these webs of caterpillars and things like that. This is the Eastern tent caterpillar. They defoliate trees in the spring, and their cousins, the fall webworms, will come out and defoliate trees in the fall. So it's no coincidence that these moth species are actually breaking out at peak times for bird migration. So this is nature's fuel for migrating birds, essentially. And one of the things I suggest, if you don't like them, you can just go and unzip those webs and make it easier for some of those predators to be able to grab those caterpillars. But there's no reason to treat with pesticides or anything like that. So and that goes along with my next thing is, if you are purchasing plants, make sure your plants aren't treated with insecticides. So more nurseries are starting to get on board with not treating plants with pesticides before selling them. But it's always best as a consumer to ask that question, because there have been multiple times where I've heard of people buying things like milkweed for monarchs, and then the caterpillars all start dying because it had been treated with one of those systemic pesticides. So try to stay away from all of that. If you're going to help these species plant for the life cycle, so not just what's going to support the adults, but also what's going to support those caterpillars. And that's one of the lists that I'm working on with some of our master naturalist volunteers, is trying to take some of the more common moth species here in Maryland and get a list together of their hosts and their nectar plants. So we have that information available to folks who want to help those different species. And we have one of those guides for butterflies here in Maryland, but we're trying to develop something similar for our moths. So planting in clumps is really helpful. So it's less energy conservation if they have to fly back and forth all around your yard. So if you're planting for those things, try to put them together so they're, that energy is losses declines. And also avoid invasive species like butterfly bush and things like that. Just because it's attracting does not mean that it's supporting them. Here's some other action items to shelter, particularly in the fall and the winter. So leaf litter is important for a lot of our species, like our Luna moths. You clean up all those leaves in the fall, and you might accidentally be throwing out your Luna moth caterpillars along with it, or sorry, cocoons along with that. So if you're in areas and you're able to leave those leaves in your garden beds or along the base of trees and things like that, that's really going to help support a lot of these species. If you're leaving the leaves in your lawn, that lawn probably is not moth or butterfly habitat, so you can get those leaves out of there. But really, the more of that lawn that you convert into natural areas, that's going to help these different species. Things like log piles, this is actually overwintering habitat for a number of butterfly and moth species. It's also a really good habitat for a lot of our other wildlife species, including things like our snakes and spiders. So do not have log piles within 10 feet of your foundation to avoid some of those negative interactions that you might have. But keep them out there if your HOA or your different organizations wherever you live will allow it. This is really important habitat. We like to clean our yards too much, and when we do that and we keep these areas clean and tidy, we're getting rid of all those spots that they're going to use to overwinter. So this is just an example of what one of those silk moth cocoons will look like hanging from trees, and they look like dead leaves on trees. So this would be like something like that Promethea moth that I showed you at the beginning. Light pollution is another thing. And locally, this is something that might be really good for the Sierra Club to start working on. It's just teaching people about the problems with light pollution. And it's not just an issue with our insects, but also birds and bats, particularly right now during migration season. So there were just some alerts that came out from Cornell about turning off lights this weekend because there were peak migration of birds that are happening. Those lights at night can disorient migrating species, but certainly for our moths and our other night flying insects, it can actually prevent them from reproducing and doing some of the things that they're supposed to do because they're attracted to the lights. There's also been some research that lights essentially make moths less effective at getting away from predators. So it decreases some of their predator avoidance features because of those outdoor lights. So in the world of light pollution, there's good and bad types of lights. In some areas we do need outdoor lights, but you can try to make it as wildlife friendly as possible by doing things like shielding the lights. So this is an example of really bad light pollution. So you need the light down here, but it's being thrown up and out and all around. So this is energy loss that we're dealing with. And then that light is polluting the night environment that's affecting our wildlife species. If you put a cover on that, that's going to stop some of that light from going up, but there's still going to be light going out to the sides. If you continue that cover and make it a little bit bigger, you get that. But if you fully shield or fully cover that bulb and direct that light to exactly where you need it, which is called shielding, which you can see on step 3 right here, that's the best thing that you can do. The color of the light bulbs also matter. And this is an area that there's still some research that needs to be done because some species are attracted to red lights and some are attracted to white light and some are attracted to yellow light. So it really depends. And for a lot of our insects, that yellow light is the most attractive. So having those white lights, that's usually going to be the better color choice for a lot of our insect species. You can check out International Dark Skies Association. They've got a lot of great information and outreach tools to talk about light pollution in communities. So this is a really important step. And this is something that, you know, a lot of people aren't thinking about. I certainly didn't think much about light pollution until the last 5 or 6 years when I started teaching about it. And then I realized how big of an issue it is. So Florida's wildlife's conservation resources, they have some really good information about wildlife friendly communities and light pollution. And that's one of the resources that I'm sharing with Lily. So you can go there and look at different types of lighting and all of that. So this is something you can work with your neighborhoods and your street lighting and all of that. So you can have some really big impacts there. Another thing just last week is Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's a $1.3 billion bill for wildlife conservation that would have essentially provide that money each year for wildlife conservation across all the 50 states and tribal nations. So it was introduced on the Congress on Earth Day just last week, and you can go to ournatureusa.com to find out more information. But this is hosted by the Alliance for America's Fish and Wildlife. And essentially, it's working to fund all of these state wildlife action plans. So each state, including Maryland, has these state wildlife action plans. It's a 10-year vision document on how we're going to manage our non-game, rare, threatened, and endangered species, and our species of greatest conservation need. The ones that we have our eyes on, essentially, we think that are going to be declining in the state before they're officially on our list. So this is a document that's essentially guiding those decisions and trying to keep some of those common species from becoming rare. So this act, if it would pass, would provide a huge amount of money and funding for conservation. And so this would be a tremendous change for our wildlife. And as I said earlier, you know, much of our funding for our state wildlife agency is funded by hunting license fees and excise taxes on firearms. So this would provide another resource to essentially help with those non-game, rare, and threatened in species. So other ways to help, and certainly, you know, one big thing is reducing that pesticide use. So that's in our gardens and things like that, and our lawns and all those areas. And just, you know, using pesticides smartly. So I don't say eliminate, because certainly some of those pesticides are important for our fight against invasive plant species or invasive insects and things. So we do have some needs, but you know, reducing that overuse is really helpful. There's a lot that you can do with research. As I said, we don't have good data on a lot of these species. So there are quite a few species that aren't ranked here in Maryland, or we have unknown statuses for, just because we don't have that data. And so, so there are some national weeks, like National Moth Week is usually in July. This is a global community science campaign to get people interested in moths and collecting data, and a lot of great things have come out of National Moth Week. So we always encourage people to participate and take those photos and take those observations and help us kind of expand our knowledge of these different species. And this is an example of essentially one of the ways that we sample for moths. So this is Jennifer Selfridge, our invertebrate zoologist, who kind of leads a lot of our invertebrate research here in Maryland. We were down in Battle Creek Cypress Swamp, and we were looking for that cypress Sphinx moth. And so we have different types of lights, like black lights and sodium vapor lights, that you attach to a white cloth. You put it out at night, and then you see everybody who visits. And so this is one way too, Mark, that you can use to get moths to kind of slow down and visit, so you can take pictures because they're attracted to that light. So just make sure that if you're using it, parks and other types of public property, that you have permission to be there after hours and doing that research. So you know, some of the spots that I like to look at, Lily, one of our best moth locations, and Maryland Biodiversity Project actually added it as a site off of on their website, and it's right off of I-68. There is I think it's called the Oak Barrel Cafe, but it's right by Sideling Hill. And because it's right by Sidling Hill, it's and they have those big gas station lights and all of that. There are amazing numbers of moths that you can actually see on the side of that Oak Barrel Cafe when you're traveling out there. And so that's one of the spots that sometimes I go with Garrett College students when they're going out to kind of view biodiversity and look at different species. We'll actually stop at that gas station, fuel up and check out all the moths there. But looking for some of those spots that might be a little darker typically, that might have a lot of native plants and things like that, might be some good areas to look for moths. And keep an eye out because they do rest during the day, so you might be able to see them during the day as well. If you want more information on different moth species, there's the field guide to moths and those leaf miners, so which include a lot of moth species. Charlie Eisman runs a blog, Bug Tracks. He's got some great information. He published this book too. And for a lot of those leaf miners, you know, being able to identify the plants that they're on is really helpful, but there's still a lot of unknown information about these species. So checking out his stuff and you know, again, making your own records can be really, really helpful. You can go to Butterfly and Moths of North America, Pomona. That's another great resource that's going to tell you a lot of that host information. So the host plants, the nectar plants and all of that. And that's essentially the website that our master naturalists are using to data mine for the different Maryland moths and we're going to use that to put together our documents for the public to kind of teach people about ways to help moths in your own spheres and spaces. So the other thing, milkweeds do support a number of moth species, not just monarchs, and teaching people to embrace more than just the monarchs and not get that tunnel vision just for the monarchs, and supporting the whole community of plants is also, or sorry, the whole community of insects that use those milkweeds is really important. So this guide is a really helpful one that talks about all those specialized relationships that also help benefit those monarchs in the long run. So, so that's all I've got for moths. And hopefully that gave you some information on actions that you might be able to do. And I will take any questions you might have.
Keith has a question.
No, I was just applauding and thumbs up.
Thank you.
I was sending screenshots of particular you know, things to my wife, so she could see the moss and all the things.
Show her those pretty species like the rosy maple moth. So
actually, I'll just tell her it's a butterfly.
yeah, I mean, it looks like a butterfly. So
Carrie, I had 2 questions.
sure.
Okay, first question is, you know, I've read all these like different you know, websites about how to track moths. I don't have, do I technically have to go find some too ripe bananas, old ripe bananas, and then you mix it up with some beer and then throw it on the sheet? Or can I just put a sheet out there and then just play around with the lights?
It's the lights that are going to attract them. There are some species that are attracted to those rotting fruit smells and that fermentation and all of that. So that's why, like the pawpaws, the flowers that are out right now from the pawpaw trees, they smell bad because they're attracting some of those moths and beetles and flies. So those that banana beer concoction is just kind of mimicking that scent and getting those types of species to come in. But it's not the only thing that brings in all the species.
Okay, and then my second question was, I live on the Eastern Shore. Is there any really great? I go to Eastern. Some reason Eastern Neck is like the place for butterflies, and we were discovering there was even moths there. So, are there any sites like on the Eastern Shore you can suggest? I live around Blackwater, so I do both, and you know,
Yeah.
it's really new. It's so new.
I imagine Blackwater. I have to admit, I don't spend a lot of time on the Eastern Shore, but I imagine that Blackwater would be a really nice spot. And I just went out to Wye Island Natural Resource Management area, and that area I was just blown away by the size of the trees and the diversity of species out there. I just went this last week, actually. I stopped on the way back from Adkins Arboretum, and I feel like that would be a really good spot to look for these different species because of the diversity of plants and the size. Like those giant oaks, those oaks are some of the best plants for butterflies and moths.
Okay. Yeah, because no one, it's really funny because no one, because I'm a volunteer at Blackwater, but no one ever talks about moths, it's always about the butterflies. And it just seems really like,
Yeah.
it's really new. I mean, because I'm a birder, so when the birds leave in the summertime around here, it gets really hard to find birds in the summertime. So I switched and I kind of do some butterflies, and then my friends, they have kids and they all want to do moths for some crazy reason. So I'm always trying to figure out something to get them
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, and that National Moth Week is a great way to get folks engaged. So they have some really good educational ideas and advertisement. And you can actually, it's just like the City Nature Challenge and some of those bigger types of community science campaigns where you can get your individual events listed on their website and they'll help with advertising and everything.
Cool. That's cool. I just hope they lift the what do you call it, the restrictions. So that's the only reason why I haven't done anything this year. But I can always do a small like gathering for say, hey, let's go look at moths.
Yeah, or you could do like, I know some naturalists are doing Facebook Live sessions where they advertise the live streams and all of that. And then essentially they're bringing that nature to people in their own living rooms and everything.
Oh, thanks, Carrie. I never thought about that. That's something that's really easy to do. So
yeah. And Lily, there are different types of lights. So people have used black lights. There's like sodium vapor lights and mercury vapor lights and all of that. So there's a moth photographers group that also talks about some of those lights that are helpful to use. So yeah.
I was wondering, does attracting the moths to the sheets disrupt their life at all?
It can. So I don't suggest going out there and doing it night after night after night. So, if you're doing a specific research project, you might have to do that type of sampling. But for most people, just here and there in your backyard probably isn't going to largely impact the population, especially if you're not running it the whole night long.
Yeah.
But
not as bad as your porch light.
Yeah, those porch lights.
You leave them on all night, every night. Yeah.
Yeah. And I see like, so I do wildlife education. I teach teachers and one of the programs is called Project Wild, and they have an activity called Lights Out, where you go out and walk around your neighborhoods and catalog those different types of lights, whether they're shielded or unshielded and all of that. And like with people doing that, even at home, we take pictures and they upload them, and they're even like people who leave their porch lights on during the day and talk about all that lost energy.
There's a couple of those in our neighborhood.
Yeah. So, and I've talked to some of my neighbors and they just don't think about it. So that's a really easy thing to make a change with, to do. And it's something that you can get kids involved with. So, making those changes with light pollution and just getting people thinking about it can be really helpful.
Most of my neighbors are afraid of security, but actually if you leave the lights on, that's just lighting it for the crooks.
Yeah. So putting those motion sensors on it, that can be helpful.
That would be helpful because the light would go on and you'd know there's somebody who doesn't belong, as opposed to just leaving them on 24/7.
Yeah. And there have been studies too that, having lights on all the time doesn't always decrease criminal activity.
Right. Yeah. So the gas station that you go to, does that not horrify you for the mortality of moths that can't get away from that?
I mean, it is a large number of moths and some of the bigger species there. So that's something that, I haven't thought about it, but that might be something that if there are some rare, threatened, or endangered species, it might be something to consider as a spot.
Well, but as maybe trying to get them to have the shields on the light so that it's not drawing all those moths to them.
That's
You
what
lose your great place to go, but
yeah.
the life
Yeah.
of the moth is maybe more important.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea. And so that's something, yeah, to consider. So
Thank you. It's been really interesting. Really enjoyed it.
thank you.
So I have a question, Carrie. Could you name a location anywhere in the state of Maryland that you think the Sierra Club should most focus on to protect moths?
Hmm. I cannot name something off the top of my head in terms of areas to protect moths, but I think like some of these spots close to these large natural areas, places around like Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and thinking about keeping that habitat around there free from invasive plants, from, dealing with the light pollution, like maybe looking at that Sidling Hill natural resource or right that gas station and spot right outside of Sidling Hill. That might be a spot to focus on some actions with some of the light pollution. So
So who in this audience wants to take on that as a Sierra Club issue at Sidling Hill, at the gas station? Anyone in this audience want to make that something you focus on a little bit for us all?
No. You have moth earrings on, aren't they?
we do. They're the rosy maple moths.
Oh, that's really funny. That's cool. That is cool. Just realized that.
And what moth has the color of your hair?
Thanks. So I think a project too is just elevating the status of moths. As Arnella mentioned, a lot of people think about butterflies, but moths are often an afterthought. But those things like those Luna moths are big, they're showy, they get people excited. And they're a great way to talk about why we need to leave that leaf litter, right? So why we need to plant native plants. If you want to see more of these species, then we have to make those natural environments, even in our own backyards. And just as we were talking about before we got started, like that's an important first step for getting people to think of larger, big scale pictures is helping stuff in their own backyards and seeing those small changes and what they can do in their backyards and thinking about what can I do next in my community, right? So so getting that going. So maybe hosting some National Moth Week events, like educational events, that might be a good first step too, is just to increase awareness and get people out there taking observations and getting engaged about these species.
Yeah. So at the next jamboree, when COVID's over, we'll have you come as the moth person. Take us on the nature walks.
This is Stella. I just wanted to note that it's really interesting to highlight the association between the various moths and their host plants. A couple of months ago, we did a program on the native trees of the DC metro area and how people, the focus was actually on how people could get native trees. So we highlighted the Maryland programs in DC and Virginia, but we kind of intrigued everyone with these beautiful charismatic pictures of some of the moths that you showed. And we highlighted the birds that were drawn to particular trees. And it was really very, very effective, showing the charismatic species that are associated with the red maple or the oak or the river birch.
Yeah. Yeah, using those pretty gateways, right? That's helpful.
That's right.
And then also for some of these misunderstood species, like those eastern tent caterpillars, many people have experience with them. They see them as a bane in their backyards. They spray pesticides to get rid of them. And that's actually, that's really harmful to the environment. So especially since they're feeding things. And so those tent caterpillars, there's some great pictures of Baltimore orioles because they're one of the species that's really good at unzipping those tents and eating all those fuzzy caterpillars and showing people, hey, our Maryland state bird, which is declining, eats these things. And if you're killing them, then you're taking away that food while they're migrating. So we need to keep this here and encourage people, like, things in our yards don't always have to look like perfect and not chewed on, right?
So can you send us a list of like pawpaw tree needs a certain moth, and spice bush and endangered species of birds and so forth that need us to protect moths for them to survive?
I'm working on it with some master naturalist volunteers.
Okay, when
So,
you get that, send it to us
yeah.
and tell your volunteer that we will take action.
Yeah, so I'm hoping I took one of the groups of like the big giant silkworms and those showy species, and I figure we'll start off with those showy species and what supports the showy species first, and try to branch out from there. So we do have a butterfly checklist for Maryland that has like all the host plants and the nectar plants. It hasn't been updated in a while, but I'll pull that up really quick.
That's great. You call it symbiosis.
So another problem with people is the fall webworm, and they think that's damaging the trees, where in actual fact, the trees have had a chance to photosynthesize all through the season, and that's really not causing any problem. And for instance, I attract all sorts of insects, and the guy right across the street from me had his tree sprayed for fall webworm.
Yeah, and I tell people those 10 caterpillars break out in the spring during spring migration, and the fall webworms are breaking out in the fall during fall migration. And there's a reason for that. It's those natural cycles and those relationships and everything. And it's just emphasizing some of those relationships, because we've just grown up, thinking that these are all pests, right? Like those little caterpillars aren't important, but now we're starting to see that they are a very important part of our food webs. And if we want to have our songbirds, which are declining dramatically, we need to have those insects, but we need to have those plants that are going to support those insects. And we need to say, it's okay if you eat some of the leaves of my beautiful trees, right?
Right.
If my columbines have those little squiggles in the leaves, that means that something is benefiting from that columbine, instead of just having, a plastic plant in my garden. So some of it is just shifting that mindset and getting people to learn about those relationships. And again, using those showy species, that's the key to kind of get people hooked, and then start thinking about some of our less showy species. So
The pandas of the moth world, right?
yeah.
So some of those leaf miners, if you take a look at the patterns in the leaves, those are beautiful in themselves.
Yeah.
They really are, just to stop and look at it. So it's just, those cute little tunnels that they make. So.
Was it time for my humor? I was, a moth was talking to me, and it said, "Thank you for taking care of our cousins, the butterflies, because they're beautiful, but please take care of us too."
Yeah, it's important to take care of both. So
I can just tell you, we just had a show on butterflies, and so many more people registered, and this talk was just as wonderful and just as important. And so I'm looking forward to having this video available to the whole community. I will make sure that it's on the Sierra Club website, and as much of your slides or whatever you want to share, the links also, if you send those to me in the PowerPoint, then they'll be part of the video. If you could do that for me, that would be great, Carrie.
okay.
I
Yeah.
think one of the issues with moths and people not being as interested in them is when they see a beautiful moth, they think, oh, that's a butterfly.
Oh,
Yeah.
Nice puppy there, Keith.
Or they think of the destruction moths do.
Mhm.
A lot of people don't think of moths as being colorful and beautiful, but they just think of, oh my God, there's my sweater. It's gone.
Yeah.
That's what, and this
True.
happened to me on several occasions. I wish I knew which ones they were. That's coming to my house and had a nice little snack off my wool knit items, but I've learned my lesson. But I think that's why a lot of people don't like them.
Yeah, my husband brews beer, and certainly with the pandemic, he isn't brewing much because we're not having people come over and all that. So he had these big grain bins in the basement, and then we had all these grain flies that are grain moths that started showing up. He's like, I don't know what all these little moths are. And he's like, I think they came in your bird seed. And I was like, those are grain moths. And my little bag of bird seed has nothing in them. Let me check your grain bins. And then we open it up, and yeah, same thing, lots of grain moths because they found that grain. And you know, they're the same thing as like pantry moths, right? So they get into your rices, your cereals, and everything like that. So yeah, you do associate them with problematic species and all of that. But yeah. So. Well, thank you all for this great conversation, and I hope to be offering this again during National Moth Week. And if you know it's safe, I might do some educational activities too during National Moth Week, which is in late July. So National Pollinator Week is in late June, and then Moth Week's in late July. So consider maybe doing some moth-oriented events, maybe online if it's not safe to do them in person. But just again, getting people interested is that first step to getting them towards the action.
Great program. Thank you so much. I love your committee. I'll have to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.